Somewhere before dawn on May 29th, 1453, a man tore the purple and gold regalia off his own body, threw it to the ground, and picked up a sword instead. He was the Emperor of the Romans. Not a symbolic title, not a historical reenactment, an actual continuous, unbroken line of succession stretching back to Augustus Caesar, 1480 years earlier. And in the next few minutes, somewhere in the chaos near a gate called the Kirkoporta, that line was going to end forever, and nobody would ever find his body to prove it. What if I told you that the ancient world, the world of Rome, of Caesar, of an empire that had existed in some unbroken form since before Jesus of Nazareth was born, didn't quietly fade into the mists of history like your textbook probably implied? What if it ended on a specific Tuesday at a specific hour, in a specific city, and we know almost exactly how it happened? And here's the question that should genuinely unsettle you. Why does almost nobody talk about this day the way they talk about, say, the fall of Rome in 476? Why is one treated as a slow fade and the other barely gets mentioned at all, when the second one is arguably the moment the actual ancient world, the real one, finally, definitively died? This is the story of that Tuesday. The day gunpowder ended 1,000 years of military history. The day the last Roman emperor disappeared into a crowd of soldiers and was never seen again. The day a 5-year-old technology called the printing press, invented 200 miles away in Germany, was about to collide with a flood of ancient Greek manuscripts fleeing for their lives and accidentally ignite the Renaissance. One single day. Let's go through exactly what happened, hour by hour, and why it mattered more than almost anyone alive at the time could possibly have understood. If stories like this are what you come here for, hit like and subscribe now, because by the end of this, you're going to understand why. Historians still argue about whether 1453, not 476, is the real end of the ancient world. Here's the detail that makes this story so much stranger than most people realize. The empire that fell on May 29th, 1453, was not some distant medieval kingdom that merely called itself Roman for prestige. It was the actual Roman Empire, the same institution, the same bureaucratic tradition, the same imperial office that Augustus had created in 27 BCE. When historians tell you Rome fell in 476, what they mean is that the western half of the empire, Italy, Gaul, Spain, collapsed under the pressure of Germanic migrations. But the eastern half never fell. It kept its capital at Constantinople, kept its emperors, kept its laws, kept its army, and its people never once in 14 centuries stopped calling themselves Romans. Not Byzantines, that word came later, invented by historians who needed a way to talk about the Eastern Empire as something separate from the West. To the men defending the walls on that final night, there was no distinction. They were Romans. Their Emperor Constantine XI was the direct successor, through an unbroken chain of coronations, to the same office Julius Caesar's adopted heir had once held. So ask yourself, when exactly does the ancient world end? Is it 476, when a teenage puppet emperor in Italy gets quietly deposed and nobody even bothers writing much about it at the time? Or is it 1453, when the actual functioning, continuously governed Roman state, with its own emperor, its own laws, its own capital, gets physically conquered, its ruler killed in battle, and its ancient institutions permanently extinguished? Most professional historians will tell you it's genuinely a toss-up. Some mark 1453 as the true endpoint of antiquity specifically because it's the moment the institutional thread finally completely snaps. There is no more Roman Empire after this day, not a fragment, not a rump state pretending, just gone. Which makes what happened over those final 53 days worth understanding in detail, because this wasn't a slow administrative collapse. It was a siege with a countdown, and everyone inside the city knew exactly what was coming. The countdown really begins in 1451, with a rejection that would prove to be one of the most consequential financial decisions in world history. A Hungarian, or possibly Transylvanian, sources vary, engineer named Orban arrived in Constantinople with an idea. Could build a cannon larger than anything the world had ever seen. Large enough to breach any wall on Earth, including, he claimed, the Theodosian walls, the 4-mile fortification system that had turned back every army that tried it by force for over 1,000 years. Constantine XV wanted the weapon. His treasury, drained by 2 centuries of imperial decline, couldn't pay what Orban asked. Ask yourself what that must have felt like, knowing the single weapon that could save your empire existed, and knowing you simply didn't have the money. Orban walked. He traveled to the court of Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old, freshly crowned, and consumed by a singular ambition his father and grandfather had both failed to achieve. Mehmed didn't just pay Orban's price. He gave him unlimited resources. What emerged was a bronze bombard nearly 27 feet long, capable of hurling a stone ball weighing several hundred pounds over a mile. Moving it required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men. Reloading it took hours, but when it fired, it was doing something no siege weapon in the history of the ancient or medieval world had ever done, systematically pulverizing walls that had been considered quite literally impregnable. By April 1453, Mehmed's full army, most estimates put it well above 80,000 men, surrounded the city. Inside, somewhere, between 7,000 and 10,000 defenders, roughly half of them foreign volunteers who had crossed the Mediterranean, specifically to die for a cause that wasn't originally theirs. They had to defend nearly 4 miles of wall. Do the math on that ratio for a second. That's fewer than 3 defenders per 100 meters of fortification, against a force that outnumbered them somewhere between 8 and 10 to 1. Constantine XI closed the gates. He ordered the ancient chain, a massive iron barrier that had protected the city's harbor for centuries, stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, and then he waited for the bombardment to begin, knowing, in all likelihood, exactly how this was going to end. Here is a moment that almost never gets the attention it deserves, because it tells you everything about the man at the center of this story. Before the worst of the fighting, Mehmed sent Constantine an offer. Surrender the city, and your life would be spared. You could rule the Peloponnese, the region of Mistras in southern Greece, as a vassal, comfortable, protected, alive. Constantine even said no. Think about what that decision actually meant. This wasn't a man fighting for personal power or territorial ambition. He was being offered exactly what any rational calculation would tell him to take. His life, a comfortable exile, a peaceful ending. Instead, he chose to stand inside a city he almost certainly understood he could not save, against an army he could not defeat, with a weapon he could not counter, because, as far as we can reconstruct his reasoning from contemporary accounts, the alternative was unthinkable to him, being the emperor who handed over the last free fragment of Rome without a fight. His famous refusal has echoed through history for nearly 6 centuries, and it sets up the question worth sitting with for the rest of this story. Was it feudal heroism, or was it the last truly Roman act performed by a Roman emperor? For weeks, Orban's cannon and dozens of smaller guns hammered the Theodosian walls, and for weeks, something remarkable happened. The defenders kept repairing the damage overnight, filling breaches with timber, earth, and rubble faster than the Ottomans could widen them. The walls that had stood for over 1,000 years were bending, but they weren't breaking. Not yet. So Mehmed turned to the sea. The Golden Horn, the natural harbor along the city's northern flank, was supposed to be secure, protected by that massive chain the Byzantines had stretched across its entrance. Every previous siege in the city's history had confirmed that the harbor, at least, was safe. What Mehmed did next is one of the most audacious logistical feats in the history of pre-modern warfare. Unable to force the chain by direct assault, he ordered roughly 70 ships hauled bodily out of the water. Greased wooden rails were laid across the hills north of the city at Galata. Under cover of darkness, using sheer manpower, his crews dragged an entire fleet overland out of the Bosphorus across dry land and relaunched it directly into the Golden Horn, behind the chain, behind the defense that had never once been circumvented in the city's entire history. On the morning of April 22nd, the defenders woke to find an enemy navy floating in the one harbor they had believed was untouchable. Ask yourself, what does it do to the morale of a besieged city, already stretched to its absolute limit defending 4 miles of wall, to discover overnight that an enemy has done something you didn't think was physically possible? The psychological weight of that morning may have mattered as much as the tactical one. The city that had never been surrounded on every side in over 1,000 years of history now was. If you want to know exactly how the final night unfolded, hour by hour, gate by gate, down to the specific unlocked door that let the Empire's killers inside, subscribe now, because what comes next is the part of this story almost nobody tells in full. Let's keep going. Before we get to the final night, there's one more person in this story who deserves real attention, because without him, the siege might have ended weeks earlier than it did. And his fate on that last morning may be the single hinge on which the entire battle turned. His name was Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese nobleman and professional soldier who sailed into Constantinople on January 29th, 1453, 4 full months before the city fell. At the head of 700 well-equipped troops he had recruited and financed largely out of his own pocket. Constantine XI, recognizing genuine military talent when he saw it, appointed Giustiniani protostrator, effectively commander of the entire land defense, and placed him in charge of the most vulnerable and heavily targeted stretch of wall in the whole city, near the Blachernai Palace and the Gate of St. Romanus, exactly where Orban's great cannon was doing the most damage. For nearly 2 months, Giustiniani was, by every contemporary account, extraordinary. He organized nightly repair crews that patched breach after breach with timber and rubble faster than Ottoman guns could reopen them. He personally coordinated a secondary moat behind the damaged sections of wall. He even planned a daring fireship raid against Mehmed's fleet, an attack that ultimately failed only because Genoese merchants living across the water in Galata secretly tipped off the Ottomans. Ask yourself what it says about the fractured, exhausted state of the Christian world at that moment that the defense of the last Roman capital could be betrayed by fellow Italians living just across the harbor. On the morning of May 29th, during the third and final Ottoman assault, Giustiniani was standing on the ramparts near St. Romanus when he was struck. Sources disagree on whether it was a crossbow bolt or shrapnel from cannon fire, and disagree further on whether the wound was to his arm, his leg, or his chest. What isn't disputed is what happened next. The wound was serious enough that Giustiniani had to be carried from the wall, and the moment the defenders around him saw their commander being taken away, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Panic spread down the line faster than any physical breach ever could. Men who had held for 53 days against the largest siege engine ever built began to waver, then break. Mehmed, watching from his command position, saw the wavering and understood exactly what it meant. He threw his remaining janissaries into the gap without hesitation. It's a brutal irony worth sitting with. A single wound to a single man. Not a collapsed wall, not a failed weapon, not a strategic blunder. May have been the actual mechanical trigger that let the ancient world's last defenses fall. Giustiniani was evacuated to a ship and died of his wounds days later on the island of Chios. He never saw how the story he had spent 2 months trying to prevent actually ended. By late May, conditions inside Constantinople had deteriorated badly. Food was running out, a lunar eclipse in the final week, read by the deeply religious population as an omen of doom, settled over a city that already understood, in its bones, what was coming. According to later accounts, on the night before the final assault, Constantine XI attended one final liturgy inside the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral built by human hands to that point in history, completed by Justinian 900 years earlier, its dome so vast that legend claimed it hung from heaven itself. Whether every detail of that final service survives with perfect historical accuracy is debated by scholars, but the symbolic weight of it is undeniable. The last Roman emperor, on the final night of Roman civilization, inside the greatest building that civilization had ever produced. The final assault began in the darkest hours before dawn on May 29th. Mehmed's strategy was brutally methodical. He sent his least valuable troops first, irregulars whose job was simply to exhaust the defenders and die in the process, wave after wave, absorbing the worst of the defenders' remaining strength. Then came regular Anatolian infantry, pressing the advantage, and then, just before sunrise, his elite janissaries, the most disciplined, most feared soldiers in his entire army, surged forward through the breaches that 53 days of continuous bombardment had finally, permanently opened in the ancient walls. Somewhere along that chaotic front, a small postern gate called the Kirkeporta, a minor access point along the walls, not one of the main gates, was found unlocked or improperly secured in the confusion of the fighting. Historians still debate exactly how it happened. What isn't debated is what it meant. Ottoman troops poured through that single gap into the city's flank, and the defense that had held through 7 weeks of the most advanced siege technology in the world began to collapse everywhere at once. Constantine V, according to the accounts that survive, tore off the imperial regalia that would have identified him, the purple cloak, the golden eagle emblems that marked him as emperor, so that he could not be captured, ransomed, or paraded as a trophy. And then he rode into the fighting near the gates with his remaining soldiers. His body was never conclusively identified afterward. Sit with that for a second. The final Roman emperor, heir to a title that had existed continuously since before the birth of Christ, that had been held by Augustus and Constantine and Justinian, simply vanishes into hand-to-hand combat in the pre-dawn chaos of his own capital, and history doesn't even get the dignity of a confirmed body. No funeral, no tomb anyone can point to. The most powerful office in the ancient world ends not with ceremony, but with a man disappearing into a crowd. By the time the sun was fully up, Constantinople had fallen. Mehmed rode into the city, through streets that had, until that morning, been Roman for 1123 consecutive years, and made his way directly to the Hagia Sophia. Before we get to what this all meant for the centuries that followed, it's worth pausing on what happened in the city itself over the next 72 hours, because it grounds everything else in something uncomfortably real. Under the conventions of siege warfare at the time, a city that resisted to the point of being taken by storm rather than surrendering could be subjected to a period of sanctioned plunder for the victorious army. Mehmed granted his soldiers 3 days. What followed was, by every surviving account, brutal. Soldiers moved street to street, looting homes and churches, and thousands of civilians who had crowded into the Hagia Sophia itself for shelter, believing its ancient sanctity might somehow protect them the way it always had in stories and legend, were taken captive instead. Historians estimate the city's population, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands during its height, centuries earlier, had already dwindled to somewhere between 40 and 50,000 by 1453 due to decades of decline, and a significant portion of those who remained were killed, enslaved, or displaced in that single weekend. Mehmed himself, according to later Ottoman and European chroniclers, halted the plunder after a single day, reportedly disturbed by the scale of destruction being inflicted on a city he intended to make his own capital. Accounts describe him riding through the ruined imperial palace of the Byzantine emperors not long after, and reportedly reciting a line of Persian poetry to himself, something to the effect of a spider standing watch in the halls of the Caesars, an owl calling from the towers of Afrasiab. Whether that specific anecdote is later embellishment or genuine reportage is impossible to fully verify at this distance, but its persistence in the historical record tells you something. Even the man who had just achieved what generations of his ancestors could not understood on some level, the almost incomprehensible weight of what had just ended in front of him. Here's where this story stops being simply a military tragedy and becomes something closer to a hinge point for the entire trajectory of human history. Mehmed ordered the Hagia Sophia converted into a mosque almost immediately. The greatest church in Christendom, the physical symbol of 9 centuries of Byzantine identity, became, and largely remains today, a place of Islamic worship. It was, in the most literal architectural sense possible, the ancient world being physically overwritten by the world that came after it. But the more consequential story wasn't happening inside the city. It was happening on the roads leading out of it. In the years before and during the fall, waves of Greek scholars, theologians, philosophers, scribes, fled west, carrying with them something more valuable than gold: manuscripts, original Greek texts of Aristotle, Plato, and dozens of classical authors whose works had barely survived, if at all, in Western Europe through the early Middle Ages. These scholars settled in Venice, in Florence, in the intellectual centers of Italy, and they brought with them the accumulated textual inheritance of ancient Greek civilization that the Latin West had largely lost centuries earlier. And here's the detail that should genuinely give you chills if you think about the timing. At almost exactly the same moment, around 1450 to 1455, a goldsmith in Mainz, Germany, named Johannes Gutenberg was perfecting a device that could reproduce text mechanically, at a speed and scale no civilization had ever achieved: the printing press. Think about what that means. In the same handful of years, one civilization's entire library was being scattered to the winds by conquest, and the machine that would soon be capable of mass-producing exactly that kind of knowledge, faster and further than any hand-copied manuscript ever could, was being switched on for the first time, 200 miles away. Historians widely credit this collision, fleeing Greek scholarship meeting a nascent printing revolution, as one of the essential sparks of the European Renaissance. Scholars who study this period argue it directly fed the rise of Renaissance humanism, and later, when scholars like Erasmus needed accurate Greek New Testament manuscripts to challenge the Latin Vulgate, that same channel of texts helped lay groundwork for the Reformation. The ancient world didn't just end on May 29th, 1453. In a strange, almost poetic way, its intellectual inheritance escaped the burning building at nearly the exact moment history handed civilization the tool that would let that inheritance spread further and faster than it ever had in 14 centuries of handwritten scarcity. There's a second consequence, less poetic but arguably just as significant. Constantinople had functioned for centuries as the critical overland link between Europe and the lucrative spice and silk trade routes to Asia. With the city now firmly in Ottoman hands, those routes became far more expensive, far more restricted, and far less reliable for European merchants. That single fact, the loss of easy overland access to Asian trade, is one of the direct pressures historians point to when explaining why European monarchs, within decades, began funding increasingly desperate and ambitious searches for sea routes to the east. The age of exploration that would eventually put Columbus in the Atlantic and Vasco da Gama around Africa didn't emerge from nowhere. Part of its urgency traces directly back to a trade artery that had just been severed at Constantinople. And there's one more shift worth naming, because it's the most literal one of all. Orban's cannon didn't just breach one wall, it proved, permanently and publicly, that gunpowder artillery could defeat any fortification humanity had ever built, including the single most formidable one in the medieval world. Every feudal lord across Europe watching this news travel, and it traveled fast, with genuine shock, through royal courts from Rome to Paris, understood the implication immediately. Castles were no longer safe. The entire military logic of the medieval world, built around walls and knights and localized feudal defense, was obsolete within a generation. What replaced it was the logic of the modern world: centralized states with the treasuries to build cannon and the standing armies to use them. Historians studying military history often point to the fall of Constantinople as one of the clearest single moments where medieval warfare visibly ends and the modern military age visibly begins. So here's what actually happened on one Tuesday in May 1453. The last continuous institutional link to the Roman Empire of Augustus and Julius Caesar was severed forever, when an emperor who had every rational reason to accept a comfortable surrender chose instead to disappear fighting at his own gates. The greatest cathedral in Christendom became a mosque within hours. A weapon that had just proven walls were no longer sufficient protection for anyone quietly ended 1,000 years of military doctrine and started a new one, and on the roads, leading. Away from a burning city, scholars carrying the entire surviving library of ancient Greek thought fled directly toward a printing press that had just been switched on for the first time in human history, setting up, almost by historical accident, one of the most consequential intellectual collisions the world has ever seen. That is an extraordinary amount of history to compress into a single calendar day. Most turning points in history are slow burns, visible, only in hindsight, spread across decades or centuries. This one wasn't. Contemporaries across Europe understood almost immediately, within weeks of the news reaching Rome and Venice and Paris, that something enormous and irreversible had just happened. Popes preached sermons about it. Kings who had ignored years of Byzantine pleas for reinforcement suddenly found themselves fielding panicked questions from their own courts about whether the Ottomans would keep marching west. The ancient world, the one that had somehow improbably kept a Roman emperor on a Roman throne for 14 centuries after Augustus, was simply finally over, and everyone alive to witness it seemed to understand almost instantly that they were now living in something new. It's worth remembering, too, that none of what came after was inevitable on the morning of May 29th. The Renaissance didn't have to follow from a scattering of refugee scholars. The Age of Exploration didn't have to follow from a severed trade route. A 21-year-old sultan didn't have to become one of history's more effective and, in his own way, complicated rulers, sparing the city's population from further reprisal after that first brutal day and turning Constantinople, soon to be known widely as Istanbul, into a new imperial capital that would itself endure for centuries. History rarely hands you a single day this dense with consequence. This one somehow held all of it at once, an ending, a beginning, and everything in between, compressed into roughly 24 hours beside the Bosphorus. So here's the question I'll leave you with. We're taught that history moves gradually, empires decline, eras blend into each other, nothing really ends on a single day. But what if that's wrong? What if the ancient world really did end on one specific Tuesday morning, in the chaos near an unlocked gate, when a man tore off his crown and rode into a crowd of soldiers who would erase him so completely that not even his grave survives? If this changed the way you think about where history's real turning points actually sit, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Do. You think 1453, not 476, is the true end of the ancient world? I want to know what you think.